I don't really frankly know what the perception of the current generation at this moment is about 228. It seems that the DPP can still get a lot of people to go to the streets when 228 comes around. But I'm not too sure of the numbers of people who came out in the February 228 street parades in Taiwan this time. I mean, there were rumors that a lot of people got Hung Bao to come out and all of that. I would think now that 228 is more and more passing out of people's memory. I mean, after all, the government has made an apology. It's set up a commission to recompense people who were cruelly, unjustly treated in the 228. And number three, it's put up a memorial. You know, I think we've sort of run the course of exhausting the things that government can do to put that thing behind the people of Taiwan. And I would think that within the next 10, 20 years, 228 will be all forgotten, and that the symbolic ideological value of 228 will have passed into memory, and very weak, confused memory at that. So I think 228 is increasingly being outmoded, overblown, and probably will not bring many people out to make a statement.
But the sentiments towards 228, at least with my personal experience, seem to be
strong? Very
strong, yes.
And what is the reason for that?
Constantly talked about. It's one of the biggest arguments against the Pan-Blue Alliance in today's current Pan-Blue Alliance.
What is the driving force of that? What does it do to, I mean, people feel that somehow the government didn't do enough and the government's got to do more? Or is it a way of saying there was a 228 and it was the KMT's fault. The KMT is trying to get power today. We can never allow the KMT back into power because of what happened in 228. Is it that kind of feeling?
Simplified, yes. They're just...
that whatever the KMT does in the future, somehow the idea is to keep 228 alive and blacken the KMT with that so that voters will correctly vote for the DPP.
It seems to be very strong because there's a park, there's a memorial park in every single county, and
yeah, it's all over the island. They've drenched themselves into memorializing the 228. It's gotten to the point where they've tried to mythologize 228. I mean, I can understand in a way why the DPP continues to, or its elites and intellectuals continue to try to elevate the importance of 228 as building a Taiwanese nation. If you really want to build a Taiwanese nation, using Taiwanhua, having a history of great events where the Taiwan people suffered together, so that you can find a way to unify the people under this great mantle of suffering and finally reaching the promised land of a Taiwan democracy, standing up in the world with the other nations, separated totally from China. This is why 228 is perhaps important to hold on to. That is, in fact, I would submit the argument that is the only reason to hold on to 228. If you're not interested in Taiwan nationalism, 228 isn't important. If you are a true ardent believer of Taiwan nationalism, and you want to have Minanhua, and you want to have the Taiwan restored its rights in the United Nations and everywhere else, then 228 is very important. And there's got to be a victim of that you can aim national political party toward? The KMT. The KMT was responsible for 228. The KMT stands in the way of building a true Taiwan nationalist state. The KMT stands in the way of the true separation of Taiwan from China. You've got to have a victim to attack. And if they don't want to stay around and be part of a Taiwan, then get out. Go somewhere else. And that, I think, increasingly is the strategy and message of Taiwan nationalism. It needs 228. Without 228, it cannot continue to function as a nationalist driving force. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it in a maligning, critical way. I'm just saying it in the way in which I think all countries have come about in creating their nationalist symbols, anthems, constitutions, and nation state with a single language and a dominant culture linked to that language. This is what the radical wing of the DPP is all about. And the more they push that, the more the perception in the United States as well as in China will be that the status quo is being disturbed, and that disturbance is creating tensions that could lead to war. And then people in Taiwan that buy into the Taiwan nationalist formula ought to ask this question: do we want to build our Taiwan nation state on the bloodied bodies of people from China, the United States? Is Taiwan nationalism worth that kind of sacrifice? They ought to think about that. Well, that's certainly an argument that Taiwan nationalists would use to justify putting all their energy and sacrifices into that great goal, to create a new Taiwan civilization that is a nation state, has its own constitution, but now deserves equal membership in the world of nations. The problem with that is very simple, that there is a country over there that has a civil war mentality, that believes they have the right of having some relationship with Taiwan because Taiwan once belonged to it, was once part of it. Not only that, this big country shrewdly was able to get about 150 other countries to sign on to the political agreement that Taiwan was part of China. And therefore, they're never going to allow those 150 countries to allow Taiwan into their ranks. That's pretty big odds. Pretty big odds to fight against, rather than to sit down at the table and talk about how Taiwan nationalism could be maybe constrained for a while to basically work with China and to make China change. Well, because none of these countries will dare have normal diplomatic relations to recognize Taiwan as a new nation state. Number two, these countries will not allow Taiwan into the major international bodies like the United Nations. Taiwan will always be marginalized and put outside the world order. As long as China can keep that kind of network of support in the international community for its claim that Taiwan is part of China. That's a big hurdle for Taiwan to jump over, even if they were fortunate enough to develop a constitution and proclaim a nation state.
I've heard the legal argument that the People's Republic of China, specifically the Communist Party, has no legal right over the island of Taiwan because the PRC has never owned Taiwan. It's
Mhm.
like it was a Qing dynasty that did. What do you think of that argument?
It's one of these what I would call sterile, arid type of legal arguments that doesn't seem to sway one side or the other, and I don't think changes the real the realistic situation that exists on the other side, basically the mainland side of the Taiwan Straits. Taiwan, that government has a very simple view of Taiwan. We fought a civil war to recover all territories that formerly belonged to China, whether it was Qing, Tang, Han, or whatever. And Taiwan is the last area that still is out of our reach. And we bloody well mean to bring Taiwan back into the fold of the motherland. That's their position. And I'm stating it not in a way that I agree with it. I'm saying this is one of the parameters that we have to realize in the international scene, in the international situation of the Asia-Pacific basin.
The remnants of the Qing dynasty have anything to do with Mao, like the early formation of the Communist Party?
Well, you know, yeah, it played into the rhetoric and arguments of the Communist Party as to why they were justified in carrying out a revolution to unify China. When the Qing collapsed and China fell into warlordism and different territorial rule, China was fair game for everybody to unite. And only the communists were able to eventually work out a way to do that. But in doing so, and then in being cheated out of their invasion of Taiwan in the fall of 1950, they decided that, all right, we'll wait. We don't have the power yet. But eventually, we will unify with Taiwan. And the Communist Party has continued to commit to that goal. I think with educated people who have read a lot of history of 228, and if they certainly read our book, which has been translated, by the way, into Chinese and was widely read in Taiwan, we've had some criticisms about some minor interpretations that really have nothing to do with the central thesis of the book. If you look at that book, what you see is a great tragedy here of two different cultures and groups of people basically conflicting with each other. And I say different cultures because Taiwan, the Chinese culture on Taiwan had been to a certain extent modified and changed under 50 years of Japanese rule and assimilation that was practiced certainly in the last decade of Japanese rule. So that when the takeover occurred, there was bound to be a whole series of bad feelings, bad perceptions, anger, and ultimately rage. Probably more on the Taiwan side than on the mainland China side, and that was the fundamental cause of this sudden, spontaneous urban uprising, which ended in a very brutal way and then the nationalist government tries to use the trick of blaming it all on the communists. Well, that wasn't true. That was a big mistake on the part of the government to blame it on the communists, but for the government that was the easiest thing to do.
What was their rationale for blaming the communists?
Number one, you could shift the blame off of yourself, that it wasn't the nationalists who did it. And number two, you could keep the people frightened that the communists had tried once to create uprisings and trouble in Taiwan. They'll do it again in the future. So you have to be on guard against the communists, and that's why you should support our government. So that was their incentive to come up with this big lie. Well, the story runs quite clearly. There were communist agents sent over after 1945. And some had even been there under Japanese colonial rule. These communist agents were linked up with underground communist groups in mainland China. And they were they were trying to foment revolution in Taiwan, just as the communists were trying to promote it after World War II was over. That was the interpretation that the nationalist government gave after Chun-Yi was removed and replaced by, I believe, by Wei Daoming. And anyway, I think our book basically, Beiju de Kaiduan, was the first scholarly statement, objective, that just said that communist cause of the 228 is just wrong.
You don't believe that there were agents in Taiwan sent by
the events took place in a more complex, spontaneous way and really had nothing to do with the communists. There happened to be one female communist in Taichung that was active, but her efforts were almost amounted to zero. She escaped to the mainland. I've forgotten her name. So that was one of the mistakes I think the nationalist government made, rather than probably reaching out. What they should have done is to reach out to the people and say, look, there's been a horrible calamity here. We bear part responsibility, but let's put this behind and work together. Nationalists didn't do that. They just said, oh, we feel sorry for you, but this was all caused by the communists, and we had to come in and clean it up. But that didn't go over well with a lot of the people in Taiwan, particularly in the central and southern areas, and even around Taipei. And certainly it didn't go well for all those families whose elite members were butchered by the nationalist troops. And certainly the nationalist troops never took into account that a lot of people escaped from Taiwan, went to Japan, the United States, and continued their effective resistance and propaganda against the nationalist government in Taiwan. So anyway, there are a list of grievances that both sides had, but I think there were probably far more serious grievances on the Taiwanese side that accounted for the hot, passionate, flaming response that took place in the cities. The question you have to ask yourself is that when all those people in mainland China that had moved to Sichuan and Guizhou and Yunnan came back to the coastal provinces to recover their homes and property and pick up their lives again, why wasn't there a big rebellion in those areas? There were lots of tensions and problems between those people coming back and mingling and picking up their lives again in the coastal provinces. But it didn't create this extraordinary upheaval that marked the Shui-bian. And I think the explanation has to do with the fact that Japan's influence in the last 10 years of colonial rule had a very profound impact on elites in particular. particularly those elites who had gone to Japan to be educated, like Peng Min-ming and many others. And they, by having a Japanese education, by learning to speak Japanese, by understanding Western liberalism and Western democracy from Japanese texts and readings, they developed a serious contempt, a severe contempt and dislike for Chinese culture and Chinese civilization. And then when they saw the behavior of nationalist troops and soldiers and civilians, who many of them did behave very badly and very illegally, the anger built up and built up, and finally this horrible violence in which Chani lost control for almost more than 2 weeks. And then Chiang Kai-shek sent troops that ruthlessly suppressed this rebellion. It wasn't even done in a how would you say, in a measured, fair way. It was just horrible. It was quite natural that this event would be that the government would create a lie as to why it caused it, and then just try to say nothing about it and stonewall any discussion of it for decades after. I can remember coming to Taiwan in 1959 and hearing some whispers about Ba, asking people about it, but not getting any explanation from them, and never knowing what Ba was all about. I spent a whole year in Taiwan, never knew what Ba was all about. And I did make an attempt to try to understand more about Taiwan history and so forth. It wasn't until many, many years later that I sat down with with a Taiwanese and with a mainlander and this Waiguoren and tried to write a very objective account as to really what happened. Well, you've laid out the general problem, but we've run out of time. It's now a half hour is up.
Okay.
And you've raised a big question, which at least is going to take probably the better part of 35, 40, 45 minutes to go over, because what I can do, I mean, I remember the book because I spent about 2 years really working my heart out on it, and I can pinpoint, just what some of the big events were that made anger build up on both sides. But you've got to remember, when these people came over from mainland China, very few of them knew Minanhua. You had a dreadful language barrier to break. Hardly anybody in Taiwan knew how to speak Guoyu. Number two, this group that came over did some pretty bad things about organizing the economy. But I'll tell you one thing, they did one thing right. They created local elections in March of '46. This would be about 7 months after coming to Taiwan. Those elections took a lot of the anger and unhappiness off the Taiwanese for a while. In other words, it calmed things down. Cheni, in a way, he was such a believer of Sun Yat-sen's thinking that, and he was so mechanistic and so unimaginative in accepting all of Sun's ideas, that he said there has to be local elections. We have to allow a free press to open up. And paradoxically, he did those things in early '46. Taiwan had a huge election. There were about 4 or 5 times the number of people went out to campaign that were actually could be elected under the rules. So what happened was Taiwan sent its representatives to the Kuomintang in Nanjing that was going on in 46 and 47 to pass the 1948 Constitution. Taiwanese began to run their own counties and cities, and they had a provincial assembly. You see, so there was the beginning of a kind of Mengya Minju-jui, a kind of embryonic democracy was emerging. But that good thing that happened in Taiwan was one of the few and only good things that calmed people down and made them more happy about the prospects for their future. Then the deep troubles began. The economy worsened. There were all kinds of injustices. There were corruptions that couldn't be addressed by the local people. And things drifted back into that awful pattern of economic cheating and despair, social discrimination, linguistic misunderstandings, and just one grievance, one problem after another began to accumulate, even under a locally elected democratic local government. And that was held in March 46. And by the end of 46, we're talking about what? 8 months. Into January, 9 months. Into the end of February, 10 months. 10 months after that election, things had gotten so bad again in Taiwan that it was just like lighting a match and throwing it on the streets filled with gasoline. And then a huge fire erupted. Now I've really boiled down a lot of the history of that period. But it was just a whole series of complicated types of interactions that got worse and worse and worse. And there was no way really for the anger to be vented, for there to be means to make sure that people got a just hearing in the courts for getting their property back and so forth and so on. And so when a rumor spread around that somebody had gotten shot and some woman trying to sell matches for a living got beaten up, it just ignited people in Taipei, and before you knew it, in every city, down to Kaohsiung and Tainan and over to the western coast, the eastern coast, and Keelung, you got people starting to beat up on Waishengren and started to set fires to official buildings. And pretty soon the government was lost control.